In chapter 17, which is our last chapter for this course, we're going to be looking at forecasting. Now, we really began looking at forecasting in a sense in chapter 14 when we looked at linear regression, because if we could determine that there was a linear relationship between the variables, then we could use the y prediction, the y hat or the y prediction value or formula to determine the possible value of y for any given x. So this is in a sense the same type of thing. We're going to be looking at values and trying to do some form of future forecasting with that. Once you take this course, the follow-up to this course, or this course is a prereq for Management 368. And Management 368 is an operations management course in which you do a lot of forecasting and predictions. So that course kind of begins where this course ends in some of the concepts that you've learned. So let's see. What we're going to cover in this chapter is the beginning of the chapter. We'll talk about forecasts in general, different methods and ways that we can forecast. Why you would use one forecast over another, depending on the patterns of your data. We'll talk about how to learn, or we'll learn how to determine how accurate our forecast is. And then basically we're going to look at three main models, a moving average, a weighted moving average, and then exponential smoothing. We're not going to cover sections 17.4 through 17.6, so you don't need to worry about those. I did forget to note, I do also have a practice at the end of, I think it's this one right here, 17.3. I'm sorry, 17.2. So I will go and update that on the PowerPoints. All right, so when you're forecasting, you can use either quantitative or qualitative data. Of course, as a stats course, qualitative data, we know that we can't necessarily make a lot of statistical analysis off of that. Those come down to more, as they say here, expert judgments or decisions that are based off of that. We prefer the quantitative because with quantitative, there's numbers. We can look over those numbers and run some analysis and some statistics on it. That's mostly what we're going to be focusing on in this chapter, is the quantitative part of forecasting, but you can have some qualitative forecasts. With a quantitative forecast, basically what we're going to do is we're going to look at information from the past. A lot of times they call this time series data. We'll look at information from the past and see if we can try and find some pattern that comes out of that data. And again, depending on the pattern that we see, depends on the method of forecasting that we choose to use. One thing I want to stop and say right here is, number one, in the real world, there are a lot more than these three methods that we're about to use. And there's also lots of forecasting tools out there for you as well. So when you get into the real world, if forecasting is one of the responsibilities that falls under your job description, know that there's a lot more tools out there, and there's a lot of methods out there. Typically what you're going to do is you're going to run your data through a variety of methods until you find one that's the most accurate. And we'll talk about forecasting accuracy in a few slides. And then once you find the one that is the most accurate, then you're going to want to use that as your forecasting method. However, you can't use that forever and assume that that's going to be the only perfect method. So a lot of times that may work for the next few forecasts, and then you need to run your data through a series of forecasts again to see if something has changed. If something has changed with your business overall, the types of transactions you make, the type of customers you're making those transactions to, your patterns and your trends may change, and there may be a better forecasting method for you to use. So forecasting, while you're going to see some of the calculations are fairly simple, the whole concept of forecasting can be a little bit more complex. And they do have companies on the market that's what they do for you, or that's what they do for your business. They'll take your data and run it through various forecasting models to help you find the best forecasting model for your business. So the book didn't talk a whole lot about that, but I did want to stop for a minute and just kind of elaborate on that for you. So with these quantitative models, again, we're going to look at historical data. We're going to try and see if there's some type of pattern that develops over this data. A lot of times this is called a time series approach because you're looking at it historically over the last few days, weeks, months, years, whatever data that you have. And you're hoping that that historical data will give us some form of a future forecast or pattern that we can develop and then predict off of. So with the time series analysis, you are trying to discover a pattern. They say history repeats itself. Well, let's hope it does if we're using a forecasting method, and that forecast can help us predict future sales, future production, or whatever it is that we are trying to forecast. We do know that there will always be some form of error that exists in this. We've learned this throughout our 2 statistics courses. When you're making a statistical analysis, you know it's not 100% perfect. There is some form of an error that will be coming along with that. All right, so these casual methods of forecasting, they say are based off assumptions that the variables we are forecasting has a cause and effect relationship with one or more variables. So kind of thinking back to chapter 14, we're not necessarily talking about a linear regression, but that one variable does have some type of influence or effect on the other. And then you'll be looking for some type of forecasting tool to help you find that relationship, find the dependent variable, and then hopefully predict a good forecast of that dependent variable based on the relationship that you can determine with the independent variable. In regression analysis, which is kind of what we did back in chapter 14, you have your independent variable, and then your time series is the dependent variable, and you are looking for some type of regression trend. In 14, we specifically looked for a linear regression, but there are other types of regression trends. Not any we're going to calculate in this chapter, but just to kind of inform you that there are some other regressions out there. So when they break it down, we talked about the qualitative. Again, there's not really much stats we can run off of that. That's more judgment. Think of a qualitative forecast as almost going to your doctor, and your doctor is looking at your past history. Your doctor is looking at similar symptoms in other patients' past history, and they're giving their best educated guess as to forecasting what your diagnosis could be. Kind of an example of what a qualitative forecast is. And yes, there are some numbers that can be run, how many patients have had this diagnosis and so on, but it's more of a judgment than a statistical type of outcome. With quantitative, we can have casual or we can have the time series. In this chapter, for this book specifically, we're going to focus more on the time series approach. So these time series patterns, hopefully there's some type of pattern that we see over an hour, a day, a week, a month, a quarter, but basically within some regular interval, we begin to see a pattern, and then that pattern helps us understand the behavior of the past so that hopefully we can predict or project the behavior or forecast for the future. Usually the first step in a time series analysis is to do a plot to see if you can see some type of pattern that exists. And then once you identify or recognize that pattern, hopefully know the appropriate or more appropriate methods of forecasting to go with. The time is on your horizontal axis, your x-axis, and then the series values, the actual values, lie on your vertical axis or your y-axis. Okay. And here's one of the first examples, and we're going to use this one for a few different methods coming up in just a little bit. The number of gallons of gasoline sold by a gasoline distributor over a 12-week period is given in the table below. The distributor would like to identify the underlying pattern of the data to guide it in selecting the appropriate forecasting methods. So week 1, they had 17, week 2, 21, and so on and so forth. So it was said the first thing we need to do is plot this on a time series plot, and that's what we have here. Another thing that I like to do is I like to have it all in one compared to where it's broken into a couple or 3 different pieces of data. I like to see it all in one piece to kind of help me set up the pattern. But here we see week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, and then we see the time series or the actual data plots that are being plotted from there. And I didn't mention this earlier, but I think this probably does make more sense. These are in thousands of gallons. So they didn't sell 17 gallons of gas. They sold 17,000 gallons of gas, 21,000 gallons of gas, and so on. So I think I'm going to stop this video here, and I'll pick up on the next video on what are these time series patterns that we're going to be looking for.